by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, WFD. WFD is the UK public body dedicated to strengthening democracy around the world. And on this occasion, we're delighted to welcome you to this hybrid side event to discuss about why and how democracy tomorrow means climate action today. I will firstly welcome and give the floor to my colleague, Raphael Aiba. He's WFD's environmental democracy advisor, and he will quickly explain why WFD is keen to host this panel session at the Summit for Democracy. Over to you, Raphael.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Good morning for those in Europe. At WFD, our environmental democracy work over the last few years has been informed by the realization that the worsening quality of our democracies is an obstacle to advance climate action in line with scientific advice. So we see that, one, an increase of climate action requires a deepening of democracy. Two, that both climate inaction and unjust and democratic climate action will create opportunities for anti-democratic forces. And three, that therefore the futures of democracy and of climate stability are intertwined. The science is clear about the risks to our civilization of failing to deliver the objective of the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to plus 1.5 Celsius. Democracy will not be the only human achievement that will struggle in a planet destabilized by a global environmental crisis. The types of likely impacts around access to basic resources and economic losses described in scenarios in the last IPCC report do not seem conducive to a rules-based world in which democracy thrives and human rights flourish. But well before that, given that effective climate action requires deep transformations of how we live, what we eat, or the cars we drive, or the jobs we have, and how our economies function, all in all, the efforts to advance ambitious climate action are also likely to erode democracy if measures are put in place without the broad public consent of a new social contract based on climate justice. Vested interests, short-termism, inertias, corruption, collusion, and policy capture actually narrow the space for the type and scale of climate action that our democracies can advance today, which may not be necessarily the most effective action or the action that ordinary people would prefer if given informed options, or which they may simply reject. If this happens, as we are starting to see in examples of this in Europe and elsewhere, with farmers taking the streets and the road for weeks protesting new environmental rules, the crisis of representativeness of our democracies is only going to worsen as undemocratic climate action is attempted, and it will pave the way for populism. And meanwhile, people's support for climate action will weaken. In turn, weakened governments will likely backtrack on climate measures or be replaced by more populist governments with little appetite for climate action. And this will result in no climate action at all when we need it so badly. So at a time when most people are worried about climate change, the well-resourced enemies of climate action have incentives to undermine our democracies, finance disinformation, and collude with populist leaders and autocratic interests. What we know is that so far, our democracies are failing in their climate action commitments, and also they are mostly missing the opportunity to invigorate democratic practice while designing climate responses. And this is to the detriment of both climate integrity and democratic health. And as a result, climate action is increasingly being captured by cultural wars and not happening at the pace and the scale that is required. And so our democracies are missing the opportunity to prove their value to people, due to well-known democratic malfunctions, which now are growing more acute around the world. So in view of these scary dynamics, we believe that it is fair to say that as the world heats up, we will end up with either more democracy or with less. We believe that delivering climate action to stave off the worst impacts of climate change requires a democratic renewal rooted in participation, transparency, and justice as a critical enabling condition, as recommended by the IPCC. In this session, we want to make the case for an urgent wave of deep democratization through climate planning in 2024, as countries develop their next 5-year nationally determined contributions. So this was my scene setting. So over to you, Maureen.
Thank you, Raphael. Our first speaker is Rachel Kite. She served until December 2015 as World Bank Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change. And she has focused much of her career on promoting affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy as the key to combating both poverty and climate change. She has been the CEO and Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Sustainable Energy for All. She was the first woman to lead the oldest graduate-only School of International Affairs in the United States as the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University until last year. Dear Rachel, it's an honor to have you with us today from the US. Thank you for staying up late to talk to us. Could you please tell us how you see the nexus between climate action, climate justice, and democratic renewal? You're on mute.
Oh, there we go, sorry. User error, it's the middle of the night. You'll forgive me. Thank you very much for the very kind invitation to be part of this panel. And let me give you my perspective now in the middle of the night here in the United States, but also spending more and more time in the UK and now teaching at Oxford. 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic that wreaked havoc around the world and exacerbated the inequality we were already seeing, the International Monetary Fund noted that inequality was the greatest corrosive force that was to undermine economic progress. And why do I mention that? Because the climate crisis and its urgency will require, as Raphael so neatly laid out, a wave of experimentation, I think, in finding our way back to effective democracy. That democracy is going to have to cope with the multiple challenges of the impacts of climate change, which are already forming a lived experience for most people all around the world, wherever they find themselves. But also the solutions are going to have to be ones that address the deep, deep, deep inequality within countries and between countries.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Yes, Rachel.
So the solutions will not be ones which are technologically engineered and financially provided for the 1%. This has to be a deep-rooted, as Raphael said, re-exploration of participation. So just to be very clear, we are now coming out of a period where, exacerbated by the El Nino effect and also exacerbated by volcanic explosions in the Pacific, etc., we are experiencing extreme heat and the warmest months that we have ever experienced in memory. This is going to continue and puts extraordinary numbers of people at risk, not in the future, not in the next decade, but right now. So the urgency is one of the issues that democracy has to respond to. Climate change poses a macroprudential risk to our economies all around the world. This means that we require systems responses, financial systems as well as energy systems, food systems, and the deepest threat is to the societal fabric that we've understood for the last few years. So our democratic structures are struggling to be agile and adaptive. They're struggling to cope with the multifaceted nature of the climate crisis. They are struggling to respond to and interpret science in inclusive policy. And democratic structures are struggling to find a way to govern well such a complicated, as Adam Tooze has called it, polycrisis. Successive waves of politicians, I believe, have failed to respond so far. It was in 2006 that we first understood that it was going to cost us more if we didn't do anything than if we did. So the cost of inaction is higher than the cost of action. And yet, since 2006, most countries have really failed to be able to put in place systems which would bring communities together around such a profound crisis that will alter their societal structures and the way they interrelate with each other. Vested interests, incumbency, and system inertia threaten the process of decision-making, and the amount of money in politics and influence of that money, in particular from the fossil fuel industry, has sought to undermine emerging consensus around the fact that there is a climate crisis and we need urgent action. We are subsidizing fossil fuel industry today at levels that we've never subsidized them before, and levels far, far, far higher than were in place when the Paris Agreement was first signed in 2015. In fact, we subsidize fossil fuels at the rate of $13 million a minute. This struggle to find democratic responses to the nature and urgency of the crisis has also led to an extraordinary unwinding of and unpicking at the edges of the international agreements that were formed at the middle of the 20th century that built the institutions that we have relied upon for international, multinational action for the last 80 years. There is a toxic mistrust exacerbated, I think, by the failure of the liberal Western democracies to deliver on the promises that they've made in successive climate agreements, promises of financial flows, promises of technical support, promises also then of support in times of crisis, whether that be food and fuel price spikes as it relates to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or even the response with vaccines to the pandemic. And this toxic atmosphere of mistrust undermines the ability to be able to form the kinds of agreements in real time that are needed. So climate change makes the vulnerable more vulnerable. Climate change will force people to move, not as headlines capture it back into the liberal democracies of the West, but most people who move as a result of climate change will be absorbed by cities already challenged by the conditions that they're experiencing, in that most people who will move as a result of climate change will be displaced as a result of climate change, will be moving into cities which are already facing their own struggles of democracy and governance, that will be situated not halfway around the world, but next door. So we look at the sponge cities of North and Central Africa as an example. Climate change is challenging the order. It will hollow out the middle class in the traditional democracies of the North. And we will see every one of the systems that we rely upon for peace and for the prosperity that we've known over the last few decades, all of these will be tested. And in fact, if we look at the in-tray of government by 2030, it will be much more complicated than it is now. The tax systems that we have relied upon for the last many decades, where we've predominantly taxed income, will find themselves completely inadequate to the size and the cost of the challenges that we're facing as far as climate impact is concerned. We failed to tax pollution, and the populations that we are providing for, youthful populations in emerging markets and developing economies, increasingly aging populations in the developed world, with the advent of advanced technologies and robotics, mean that our tax systems will not be fit for purpose. Governments will then have to face a broader fiscal set of questions, and will have to face a broader set of questions related to social safety nets and migration, etc. But at the same time, people's response to the climate crisis and the failure of democracy to keep pace with it and to provide them with solutions does not mean in most countries that the climate crisis is falling down the list of priorities for individuals. And as we experience a year where more than 60% of the world's population is going to the polls, we see that no matter the cost of living crisis, the challenges for peace, the challenges for stability in most parts of the world, climate is the number 2 or number 3 issue for voters. And so this is, I think, forcing people to look at new ways of innovating in delivery of democracy. We see increased interest and experimentation with citizens' assemblies and other structures designed to support effective, inclusive, and timely decision-making in support of Parliament, in support of existing structures. And I think, given the urgency that we experience, finding new ways to bring people together in order to hear each other, and also in order to find the common space for decision-making, is very important. And then I would just say that I think the climate movement bears an extraordinary responsibility to be able to support this kind of innovation and democracy more broadly. In many countries, the climate movement has targeted its advocacy at the very top of the political ladder. But we see in many mature democracies that it is the election and the support of citizens at the local level who need to make complicated decisions around locally led adaptation, informed by all sectors of their community. It is local planning commissioners that will hold the secret to whether or not a transmission line can come through the community, whether or not the funding has been agreed by Parliament many, many miles away. So I think reinvigorating democracy at the local level, looking at the short-term specific planning and permitting and visioning and designing issues that really represent the response to the climate crisis, with the introduction of renewable energy, off-grid and on-grid, with the introduction of new science and technology into our agricultural sector to support farmers. This has all been missing while we have had a politicized, ideological, deeply divisive debate fueled by dark money at the top of the ticket, as it were, in many countries around the world. And one final thing is, it was very clear at COP28 in the way in which the agreement was reached that there are a number of countries who are not democracies, who are not afraid to make long-term planning decisions because they are able to control the parameters of those long-term decision-making they think in the short term, and who see that democracy is actually a weakness in our response to climate change. How we elect a generation of politicians who are prepared and able to engage in innovative ways of having a conversation where we speak the truth to people. We do not shy away from what this climate crisis will bring, and that together there are ways for us to be able to survive and in fact thrive in the immediate need to build resilience. We do have to take on those who believe that democracy is a weakness in our response and not a necessary condition. And so finally, I would just say that we have room for innovation. There is innovation happening in many democracies around the world. And of course, there is always innovation in the desperate fight for freedom and independence in non-democracies around the world. And we will need that kind of innovation in democratic process in order to produce the climate response, because resilience, the resilience that we need as communities and as nations and in our international system, will demand a resilience in our democracies that today we fear we may lose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing your views on the risks for climate action or failing to respond to people's needs when designing disruptive decarbonization pathways, and on the risks for democracy of failing to respond to people's expectations of just and effective climate action. Now, at the heart of the environmental democracy conversation is Parliament. So today we're privileged to be joined by Honorable Biika Lawrence Songa, a member of Parliament, who chairs the Committee on Environment, Natural Resources, Climate Change, and Science and Technology and Innovation, and is also the chair of the Parliamentary Forum on Climate Change in the Parliament of Uganda. Honorable, please tell us more about how the Parliament of Uganda engages in the formulation, or rather engaged in the formulation of the first NDC. Was this engagement foreseen in Uganda's Climate Act?
Thank you very much. Hello to everyone. My name is Biika Lawrence Songa, Member of Parliament in Uganda and Chair of the Climate Change Committee in Parliament. As far as the NDC is concerned, the Nationally Determined Contribution, of course, around 2015, we made what we call the intended nationally determined contribution. And of course, that came into force earlier than expected. And now, what is happening is, our Parliament came in, we had the Parliamentary Forum on Climate Change in Uganda, and I had been the chair. By 2017, we had to get involved to see that all the processes in making Uganda climate resilient involve Parliament. And when we went to COP in Marrakesh, we came back and engaged the ministries, departments, agencies, the civil society, private sector, and academia to see that our nationally determined contribution is really comprehensive to address the climate challenge.
Okay. Honorable?
And do you pick me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes. The forum engaged the different stakeholders to see that we made a comprehensive document. And so for us as a forum, we made two targets. Our target was to have a climate change law in Parliament, and also to ensure that in the law we provided for a certificate so that we have climate finance. And also climate change committee in Parliament. By then there was no committee. So we engaged all the stakeholders to ensure that the issues that are being discussed around climate change are reflected on the floor of Parliament. And along that line, we achieved the two targets we wanted. We created a committee in Parliament, and also we made the climate change law in Uganda for the first time. Now, in the law, we also provided for certificate because the issues around that was lack of funding to address some of this climate change crisis. So what happened was we made in the law that no ministries, department, and agencies budget can be approved on the floor of Parliament unless it is accompanied by a certificate showing that there is substantial amount of money put in the budget of that ministry or department or agencies to address climate change. And that was one way to have our climate finance locally. And so we have already tested that law 2 times, and we are going for the 3rd time now. And that is the only way we ensure that money can reach the various ministries, departments, and agencies. Then number 2, we wanted to create a climate change fund in the country. That was not supported, but in another way, we created what we call the climate finance unit, because there are donors who are interested in funding climate change activities in Uganda, but they are not willing to put their money in the consolidated fund. So we created the climate finance unit as a window for such particular donors so that it can mobilize resources to address climate change in the country. Then we went ahead to integrate climate change issues into the curriculum from primary, actually in the education and research, from primary up to the university level. And that would help to create awareness in the country. Now, when Uganda updated the nationally determined contribution, in the updated nationally determined contribution, it became very comprehensive because there was enough consultation, whether within Parliament, with different stakeholders. So we set even a target. And then the earlier one, we had 22% emission reduction. But in the updated NDC now, we have 24.7% emission reduction by 2030. So we are following that to see that all ministries, departments, and agencies, civil society, academia, and private sector follow this and make their contribution to the updated NDC. Now, what is happening right now is we cannot leave anyone behind in climate change issues in the country. That's why my committee works with even civil society, academia, and private sector. Because the contribution made by these bodies cannot be left out when we are talking about Uganda reducing emission by 24.7%. And that is a very good involvement of our people to see that we make Uganda climate resilient. Now, the last challenge we have is now, how do we generate money since the developed democracies are not fulfilling their pledges of $100 billion to fund climate action in the developing world, including Uganda? So that has been a very big challenge. Then we are now trying to our best to engage to see that how can we generate money locally to address climate change in the country. Now that brings me to the point of where we have Uganda as now oil and gas. Now this oil and gas is a challenge to climate change. We have a lot of minerals that are needed for decarbonization, but the challenges that are coming with the decarbonization is that it has created competition for the minerals in Uganda, in Africa. If you look at DR Congo, Central African Republic, and all these countries, South Sudan, because people want to get these minerals that are needed for decarbonization, and most of these challenges are coming from outside the African democracies, that has already posed a big challenge to conflict. Now, in those conflict countries, no one is now focusing on climate change actions. Instead, they are focusing to bring peace and security. That is the missing gap. All of us in the world, we need to talk about that, to see that we go systematically so that we can balance the nexus between democracy, climate action, and the economy. And then now on the oil and gas, the argument of Uganda is that what is the problem? If oil and gas can generate, let's say, 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide, and then we create a sink that can also absorb all the 10,000 tons of emissions. So that is the argument on Uganda. And also Uganda is saying, we need money, but now where do we get the money since developed democracies are not fulfilling their pledges? And yet we have pressures from the local people to address some of the challenges of climate change, including those that are associated with the natural disasters like floods and also landslides. Then the last part is, there is also this argument that some of these developed democracies are talking about climate change, but at the end you see that there is no transparency. While they are telling most developing countries to leave their oil underground, that's okay for us in the climate change advocacy. But now, why is it that some of these developed democracies are still expanding oil fields, coal fields? So this is the argument where it requires everybody in the world to come and show that kind of transparency so that we move step by step. Of course, we have a target. Others want to achieve that by 2030, maybe net zero by 2030, others want by 2050. So we are going gradually. So it is not an abrupt change. When you come to the local communities where I live, you get people using firewood and charcoal. There is no way you are going to say, now we need to move to the next level. Maybe you start using electricity, which is still having low coverage in the country. So we need to balance between economy and also climate change issues, but also we have to do a lot of cost-benefit analysis. If the cost of our action, yes?
I'd like to just take you back to a point that you made earlier on civil society's engagement. And of course, we appreciate that in Uganda, like many other countries, there are customary spaces for citizens to engage and hold their leaders accountable and discuss issues affecting their communities. So how do you think parliaments could build on these popular practices to innovate democratic practice, make decision-making on climate change more inclusive, and become more central in national debate about the appropriate policy choices on climate this year as countries prepare for the next NDCs?
Thank you. Thank you very much. In fact, it is in Uganda where we have really engaged the civil society at the committee. The civil society organization had been struggling to advocate for many things, including climate change outside there. And they were using long routes for these issues to reach government. But now for us, we invite this civil society organization, academia, and private sector directly in the committee. And the next day, we are presenting the report on the floor of parliament and getting response from government and also the government ministries. So I think this is the only way we can work amicably with the civil society without leaving anyone behind. And the civil society is also helping us to supplement what government cannot do by going to the communities, gathering all these issues and bringing them straight away to the floor of parliament and getting a response. That is a quick climate action we are doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comprehensive submission. So we want to take a break and listen to a video. One of our speakers isn't able to join us. Jenny Keane, she's the Director of Climate Research and Policy at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London. Through ISD, she helped found Climate Action Against Disinformation, that's CAAD, a coalition of over 50 organizations working to identify, analyze, and counter climate disinformation worldwide. She has spearheaded investigations on climate denialism and discourses of delay in the context of Australia, Canada, Central Europe, Germany, South Africa, the US, UK, as well as co-authored a number of ISD flagship reports on this issue. So we'll watch a video that addresses some key elements of our conversation today. Sound, please. go back to the video.
So I think what's so interesting about this summit and the convening that you're all having in Korea is that we believe democracy is the most effective system to deliver for society and to include average people in decision-making in a meaningful way for the best possible outcomes. And for something like the climate crisis, which is all-encompassing, it will touch every single person in the world to a greater or lesser extent, we are really reliant on having a shared sense of reality and a common understanding of the pathways forward, including the trade-offs that are associated with those pathways. And unfortunately, where we've got to in the last few years is that climate has become a victim of a trend which has befallen a number of policy issues: migration, public health, sexual and reproductive rights, racial justice, civil rights. And that trend was so clearly observed at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in that kind of information environment, climate has become a lightning rod for conspiracism, for mistrust in institutions, and for exploiting social divisions in really profoundly harmful ways. Now, at ISD, the organization I work for, we'd often refer to that as being the focal point of a hybridized threat landscape. And what we mean by that is that your traditional climate deniers, so people who have been saying this isn't a problem since the 1970s, they have merged with a much broader universe of online extremist and conspiracy movements, of those who are producing disinformation for commercial ends, of online outrage merchants, as they're often called, and of right-wing and far right-wing political movements. And in the process, the number of people who stand to benefit from producing or sharing or amplifying mis and disinformation around climate change has exploded in the last 5 years. And the incentives for doing that are not just financial, but they are ideological. And if I could just touch briefly on what that means, is it's the difference between saying, we are going to spread misleading or even actively false and unsubstantiated claims about climate because we want to maintain reliance on fossil fuels, right? Which is, in a way, the traditional or historic form of climate denialism, to using climate as a point of entry to undermine faith in liberal democracies and democratic processes writ large. So it's the idea that climate action is somehow representative of government overreach, of illiberalism, of elites versus average people, of imbalances of power, of shadowy conspiracy theories, of efforts to control communities and to disempower them. And as a result, this kind of content has the potential not only to delay our transition to a cleaner and more sustainable future, but that actually it's a key driver of these much larger trends around crises of faith in institutions, in government, in media, in science, in experts, and that it compounds what we're already seeing take place in so many countries, which is the fracturing of society and a polarization that makes it impossible to deal with any crisis, let alone something as severe as climate change.
Great. So in that first video, we get to hear about what Jenny has found out about climate misinformation and denialism. There's a second video, which basically speaks to how worse it's going to get. Under the Paris Agreement, countries have committed to ever more ambitious climate action, spelled out in national pledges every 5 years, the NDCs. Climate action has got very powerful and well-resourced enemies. It is expected that as parties set up ever higher levels of ambitions, the level of effort of actors pushing climate disinformation will also increase. So we get Jenny's views on how to face this upcoming storm in the next video.
I think what is absolutely critical going forward, and where really we've seen not enough attention paid to date, is bringing average people into the conversation around how climate science is developed, why we have certainty about aspects of it, why 99.9% of the scientific community is in consensus about this problem, but also humanizing it and bringing it much more down to a local level. for many people, the climate crisis still feels hugely abstract, and that makes it very, very vulnerable to weaponization. Because, as I said in my first answer, it can be symbolic of all of these large power struggles, whether that's internally within a country or whether it's geopolitical tensions between countries. And at this moment where a lot of people are looking inwards, they're becoming more isolationist, they don't believe in cooperation, they don't believe in big government, climate change is a very, very good line of attack for bringing people into that kind of conspiratorial and oppositional space. If you want to do effective climate policy making, and you also want to safeguard democracy and people's faith in democracy, then you need to make this crisis intelligible for what's happening to them and to their communities. And that, might sound trite, but it happens far less often than you think. Instead, you get these big kind of all-encompassing legislative agendas that come from on high. And sometimes there's, efforts to communicate that to the general public, but still at often an abstract level. And people find it very difficult to contextualize what that means for them, what it means for their families, what it means for their ability to have agency and control over their futures. And any conversations about climate justice, climate action, climate policy, climate mitigation and adaptation needs to put local people on the ground at the heart of discussion, and that communications need to be structured in that way.
Great. And finally, what is the role of the media and of regulations about media freedom and digital platforms going to be? Let's hear what can democratic governments do about it.
I think that there is a really critical balance to be struck between safeguarding independent journalism and media as a foundational tenet of democracy, while also recognizing that legacy media, by which I mean print, broadcast, radio, can also be perpetrators of mis and disinformation and can amplify harm in a way that far extends the reach of an average social media user. So, on the one hand, there are a number of contexts around the world where journalists are not only being vilified, but are actually under threat of their lives for doing reporting about the climate crisis. And that might be because their countries have histories of sort of industry lobbying and corruption and malpractice, and that trying to expose some of those harms puts them at great danger. But it's also because there may be more constricted media environments in general where critiques of government action are not well received, and where the public has sort of been pitted against independent journalism as though journalists are the enemy. So I really want to kind of emphasize that point up top, that there is a concerning and spiraling trend of journalists who are at the front lines of trying to navigate and understand and interpret environmental crises and the pathways forward for the public being at risk themselves. Having said that, there is also this other parallel danger, which is that media outlets can themselves be hubs for harmful, divisive, dangerous, and misleading content. And policymakers around the globe at the moment are developing a whole new era of tech regulation. They're deciding how and where government would intervene to protect their citizens online. And among this question is whether tech companies should moderate the content of media outlets who are active on their products if that content violates community standards and terms of service. And, the argument coming from a lot of broadcasters and media lobbies and publishers is that any sort of restrictions on them would pose an existential threat to freedom of the press and therefore to freedom of speech. And I think that is, it's a valid concern. But at the same time, you cannot just grant media outlets or those who are claiming to be media outlets with de facto impunity in what they post and they share online. In part, there is the challenge in defining what constitutes a legitimate media outlet or a journalist in the digital age. And lots of people are applying that terminology to themselves, even though they are not being held to any sort of editorial standards or kind of ethical considerations in what they post. But also, we have to recognize that many media outlets have outsized reach and influence and authority on public discourse. And so what you can end up with is this kind of perverse scenario where let's say, a mainstream newspaper tweets outright disinformation to millions of followers about something related to climate science or climate policy, and that the platforms are unable to act, not necessarily by banning that account, but even by downranking it or reducing its visibility or applying a fact-checking label just because they are a media outlet. And I don't think that those kind of all-out exemptions contribute to a healthy information ecosystem writ large, but it does come down to that fundamental point of the nuance in how you protect media freedom and pluralism and access to reliable information, while also making sure that these actors who are, pillars of democracies and pillars of public life are not able to abuse that position and exist in this kind of privileged realm where they never have any scrutiny or any regulation.
Thank you. So information is power. If citizens do not fully understand the risks of climate change or the different possible responses that may be put in place, they're effectively disempowered as democratic actors. They cannot reward political platforms committed to just and ambitious climate action. They're also disempowered if they do not know whether the action of government is putting us on track to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But the scientific community also feels disempowered, seeing how their warnings and advice to governments is not reflecting in public policy. Most of you may be aware of the Scientist Rebellion, which is an international scientist environmentalist group that campaigns for degrowth, climate justice, and more effective climate change mitigation. They believe it is important that ordinary people understand that decision makers are not listening to them, to break a false sense of security in which they may believe that things are under control. And to bring this message across, they engage in nonviolent civic disobedience. This has had legal consequences for a growing number of them, like our next speaker, Net Rook, who is a researcher on environmental conflicts from carbon offset projects at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and co-founder of the Extinction Rebellion Spain. Net, would you say that the civic space for nonviolent protests against lack of sufficient climate action is closing? Please tell us more about your personal experience.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for the invitation today. For me, I started Extinction Rebellion Spain in 2018, and with several other comrades in our group, and we basically saw that within the climate movement, we were lacking some kind of urgent messaging towards the public to say that where we are going right now and what is happening at a political level is clearly insufficient for tackling the worst effects of climate change. There has been a messaging generally that things, if we just continue down the path that we have and trust our governments to act, that we can just pressure and actually get the outcome that is necessary. But clearly, as we have seen with the 1.5 degree IPCC report, that the direction that we're going is far insufficient, and the changes that we need are at a policy level are totally unprecedented, and our democracies and governments around the world are not prepared to make those decisions. So for me, I spent the first couple of years experiencing that in Spain, and well, in many of the other Western countries of Europe, that the level of repression was not so high, that when we were taking action, that at most we would get a couple of fines, which also, are difficult for us to deal with because many of the activists don't necessarily have much money to deal with that kind of repression. But as we've gone along and we've seen that governments in the West are growing in level of repression. So whereas in 2019 we did actions, for example, at COP25 in Spain, and saw very little repressive action from the Spanish government at that time. And now, there are many activists who have been taking action over the past year and a half, 2 years, and we have gotten to the point where the Attorney General's office has accused actions done by Scientist Rebellion and Extinction Rebellion and other groups, such as Futuro Vegetal, that accusing of terrorism and also using allegations of criminal organization to discourage nonviolent climate activism. So for me, I participated in some actions in Germany in 2022 with Scientist Rebellion in coalition with several other groups. One is called Last Generation in Germany, and another one, Debt for Climate, that advocates for debt cancellation for Global South countries as a measure that can give developing countries a chance to get out of this hole that they're in and actually be able to make a just transition. And this resulted in, after 8 actions of me and 16 colleagues ended up being imprisoned for our nonviolent actions for a week. And this is an example of how in the growing level of repression is getting to the point where we're seeing in Germany, there's been many activists who have been imprisoned for months. In the UK, we've seen people even imprisoned for years. The co-founder of Scientist Rebellion was recently released from prison for being participating in a nonviolent action actually against companies that are providing weapons to the Israeli state in order to condemn the genocide in Palestine. But his sentence was made longer because of the fact that he was also doing many climate action protests, and also will be facing sentencing today that could result in up to a year of prison. So we are seeing that many of the activists now are changing tactics or are becoming even just discouraged from acting. Within many groups in Spain, I can say that people are becoming scared to take action or to speak out and not exactly sure how to respond in this growing level of repression. Many of the activists are also, I mean, as a climate activist, one of the things that we always are looking to do is expand our numbers of people who are willing to take action in some way, whether it's something that is nonviolent civil disobedience that breaks the law, or at least participate in a support role. And it's becoming harder and harder for many of the groups to get people to participate out of fear, and also fear of even speaking just calmly between ourselves because of the police infiltration that has been in many activist groups. So, but this, it's kind of pales in comparison to what many activists in the Global South have already been facing. We've seen, for example, in Panama, there was a big protest, and recently over mining contracts, and activists there have also faced extreme violence. We've had one in Scientist Rebellion who also lost an eye. I mean, we've seen this also in many Global South countries. Our activists in Africa and in South America have also really felt like they cannot always take the same risks as many activists in the Global North because of the fact that they face imprisonment and even torture. And as we've seen over the past few years, that people are responding more and more to the local impacts of climate change and the extractivism that is also causing the climate change in their local communities, and that has also become more and more criminalized. And just referring even to one of the mechanisms, which is REDD+, It's a part of the idea of selling carbon credits on an international market. Many of the activists there, so something that I study at the ICTA, is that we see that these people who are just fighting for preserving their lands are being either pushed off or also facing higher militarization and also death threats and other types of severe repression for trying to find a clearly beneficial solution to conservation projects that later are being packaged and sold on international markets that have very little transparency and often have resulted in higher carbon emissions from fossil fuel companies that are buying and using these carbon credits to basically greenwash their businesses.
Okay, Nat, my final question to you is, as the stakes around the climate action get higher, do you expect things to get worse for climate activists everywhere? Can climate action advance without social empowerment and the oversight of civil society organizations? And what would be your ask for the global democracy community?
Yes, I mean, it's clear from my studies and also from my direct experience that as the climate crisis gets worse, we're going to face more and more conflict in many ways, whether it just be within communities or between states for resources and basic security of food, housing, any kind of basic services that we will need. So this is going to result in most likely, if we are not prepared to democratize as much as possible, more violent conflict. So basically, as a climate activist, we're seeing that states that are not willing to change the path are clearly going to silence any kind of climate activist that is putting the interest, economic interest, and policy measures that are going against the general population at risk. So with my biggest ask for the global democracy community is to engage communities in several different ways. One can be citizens assemblies or citizens panels, but also not that they just exist, because if we are having citizens panels and citizens assemblies and the measures that come out of these are not actually being implemented and they're not being taken to a policy level, then they're basically meaningless for communities, and the type of disempowerment that people feel will only grow, and the kind of distrust for governments and this growing kind of conspiracy theories that are harmful to climate action will continue to be grow and allow and have, because many of the these kind, as one of the previous panelists mentioned, are these conspiracy theories are thought of in a way of that the elites are trying to control the general population and not look out for the general interest. So if people think that that the policies that are coming out of government are not responsive to their needs, then they will not be trustful of them. And so I guess I asked mostly that we are looking for ways that not only engage citizens, but actually implement the measures that are come out of these processes.
Great, thank you so much, Net, for sharing your experience. Our next speaker I'd like to invite is Malini Mekra, CEO of Global Legislators, the parliamentary focal point organization under the UNFCCC. She's also the chair of the Just Transition Group, London Sustainable Development Commission. Thank you so much for the early morning call, Malini. Having listened to Honorable Songa, we'd also like to hear about your work in promoting parliamentary empowerment on climate. This session is making a case for an urgent wave of deep democratization through climate planning in 2024, as countries develop their next 5-year NDCs. The need for parliamentary engagement for the implementation of the Paris Agreement through through the exercise of their powers of lawmaking, budget, and oversight is well understood. But what about their role as institutions representing the people to lead an honest, informed national conversation about policy options for climate action, best aligned with the public interest, and to broker ambitious political trade-offs and compromises on policy options that carry social majorities behind? At present, are parliaments elbowing their way into the NDC design process in the countdown to the official submission date next November to play this critical role upstream in the process, giving it an early steer? If not, is it too late to prompt them to action? Your thoughts?
So thank you so much, Maureen, and good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, good evening, and the time zones that you're joining us. So I'm joining you from London, and thank you very much to the organisers for tabling this very important discussion, really at the beginning of the year of a super election year when almost half of the world's population is going to the polls. So you've posited the proposition, why democracy today means climate action tomorrow. And Maureen, as you mentioned, you're really calling for an urgent wave of deep decarbonisation through climate planning. So what I thought was certainly going to be talking about the role of parliaments and parliamentarians and citizens, because that is really absolutely essential to delivering on the climate commitments which have already been undertaken by not just countries, governments, but also our cities and our local governments at the towns, the villages level. So it's really an issue which has come down from a very top-down approach in terms of national planning, international commitments, to very much a local lived challenge for citizens. But let me begin with some good news. So in 1997, I was at the Kyoto Climate Conference. That was COP3. We're now preparing for COP29. And in those intervening years, time has not stood still. So just as a kind of reality check to ground us in where we are in terms of international climate planning. So of course, we're talking about the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. We know that we are now approaching the next cycle of the 5-year cycle of the NDCs, which are expected to be delivered, submitted by governments by 2025. But where does this come from? Well, it comes from 1997 and COP3 and the original COP commitments, which were there for just industrialized countries. Now we have all countries, 195, which have committed themselves to having their national plans to address climate change. Since 97, we have developed an international architecture of climate change laws and policies. It covers the globe. So we have more than 5,000 climate change policies and forms of legislation across the world. In many countries, such as the United Kingdom or in Uganda or in Mexico, we have climate change framework laws. These are extremely important because these provide the legal underpinning for so much of what we have seen occur, which has helped to effectively bend the curve on the energy pathway for many countries, enabling many countries around the world to ensure that they have decoupled their economic growth from their energy use. But let's come to the NDCs now. And so we are now, as I mentioned, we are looking at the next cycle of enhanced, much more ambitious NDCs. But to date, we have, out of the 195 countries that signed up to the Paris Agreement in 2015, we have 192 countries which have already submitted NDCs. Now, these cover 96% of global emissions. Of these 192, we have 178 countries, so that's 94.1% of global emissions, who have submitted new or updated enhanced NDCs already. And 109 of these 178 countries, i.e. almost 90% of global emissions, 90% of global emissions, yes, have submitted enhanced NDCs with reduced total emissions compared to the original ones. So we are seeing that there is a serious effort across the board, many governments who are committing themselves to even further decarbonization. Of course, this is not just an agenda which is about decarbonization. It also has to be about adaptation and building in climate resilience. And if we're looking at the next cycle of NDCs, adaptation to the climate impacts that are gathering in pace, in strength, in devastation across the world are something that policymakers and planners have to ensure are integrated in this next cycle of NDCs. Okay. So that was the first point in terms of where we are in this new cycle that we are beginning to, countries this year will be beginning to get real about. But of course, the reality check, the other reality check is a couple of us have already mentioned that this is the super election year. So we know across the board that climate concern has now become pretty much mainstream. Publics, when asked about climate change, recognize that it is an issue, that it is something they expect their leaders, in particular their political leaders, but not only, also business leaders and local government leaders to take much more seriously, that there is public concern. The key issues around division in societies is around the methodology. So how do you get to bend the curve on climate change? What does climate change look like? Who are the winners and the losers of particular policies? And that is where we have seen the greatest friction and the conflict points across the world. And in particular, I think many of us will have the farmers' protests at the front of mind, where there is strong perception that there is not a just transition in the agricultural space, as policymakers are trying to introduce policies which are changing the price structure and introducing subsidies, taking away subsidies. Rachel Kite mentioned fossil fuel subsidies, but of course there are subsidies that farmers have been accustomed to for water pricing and for agriculture, for farm pricing also. So this is a very big year in which we are in some countries, although not all. So it's very important that we do not project from the experience of a country or a group of countries to the rest of the world. But we are seeing in many countries where climate change is becoming a political wedge issue, where action on climate change is seen as something that left parties do and right parties are not interested in. In fact, what they are fighting is a reduction in big governments and in the amount of intervention in the economy. So the key thing for us, and coming back to Globe's work on this, of course, Globe parliamentarians are those who have been at the forefront of creating this international architecture of climate change legislation. From the very beginning, Globe is now more than 30 years old. And we very much approach this as a cross-party, non-partisan issue, really emphasizing the need to move beyond left and right in terms of the necessity of taking climate action. So, Maureen, I'm happy to hand back to you for now because there's a lot to say on the subject. But if you'd like me to pause now before I address the issue beyond elections, what can be done? Happy to pause now, but please give me a steer on that.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that. I think our question would be now, so how can parliamentary climate champions help empower citizens with climate information and transform the way in which ordinary citizens participate in decision making? And what are the risks for democracy of not doing so?
Well, so let me point to some of the practical examples that we've seen around the world. So the first is that parliamentarians and parliaments as a group are not recognized as one of the major groups within the UN system. So if we are looking at the engagement of a range of different stakeholders, from farmers to trade unions, to women's organizations, to business, to research centers, each one of these stakeholders, these categories, these social groups, are recognized as a major within the UN system. So every time there is a big UN climate conference, the so-called COPs, then each of these major groups has an opportunity to engage officially within the process. Parliaments do not have, they're not recognized as a major group, and so we do not have the same access that the other formal major groups do. However, parliaments themselves take it upon themselves, and they can do so on a formal annual basis every time there is a COP, to have a review of the outcome of the COP. We are seeing this increasingly become a practice which is adopted by parliaments around the world. Every time COPs are always in December, and so we are encouraging that already at the beginning of the year, that parliamentary committees, parliaments, ask questions of the government as to what was delivered in the COP before. But beyond that, fundamentally, parliaments and parliamentarians' relationships are with their constituencies. And this is where we think there is the most, in a sense, there is the greatest room for a renewal, a democratic renewal of the pact between citizen, the civic entity in our polities, and the parliamentarian. So what does this mean? This means practically that you have a senior parliamentarian like Honorable Songa, that he will have a constituency. Within Globe, we have an initiative called the Student MP Climate Surgery, where we create a framework for politicians, for parliamentarians to engage with the young people in their constituencies, to let young people know through school engagements and other fora what they are doing, to explain to them the parliamentary process of coming up with NDCs or contributing to NDCs or holding the government to account for commitments that have been made. Not only sharing that information with their young constituents, but also finding out from their young constituents. So what matters to them? How do they want to be involved in their communities on taking action to address climate change? And importantly, how do they want to be involved in the decision making? So we promote this two-way dialogue between the constituents and their representatives in parliamentary democracies. And that is absolutely essential to address the deficit in trust that there is. This is not just at an intergovernmental level. This is very much strongly felt at a national and at a local level, where there is a deepening cynicism and a mistrust of institutions, and in particular of political institutions. So that democratic deficit, that the need to enhance trust in institutions and the role of parliaments and parliamentarians is absolutely critical if we are serious about placing parliaments at the heart of democratic accountability and deepening action on climate change. Thank you, Chair. Back to you.
Thank you. And finally, if the commitments to the principle of no regression and to the ratchet mechanism of climate ambition under the Paris Agreement cannot be delivered upon in the absence of a new social contract brokered by parliaments, how can the democracy community support their efforts to deliver this social contract cemented on climate justice this year as countries prepare for the next NDCs?
So I think that in this, institutions must always reinvent themselves through dialogue and through civic engagement. So in terms of the democracy and the climate change communities, it's very important, as you and this session are underscoring, is that democracy lies at the heart of sustained climate action, which is not to say that of the 195 countries which have signed up to the Paris Agreement, that all are democracies. Far from it. There are a number of countries which would be classified as autocracies, which nevertheless are taking climate seriously and are putting in place policies and measures to ensure that the country is able to bend the curve on its energy transition pathway towards greater decarbonization, and which is seeking to protect its population. However, if we take democracy broadly as a public good, then we know that with the challenge for climate action is fundamentally it's a democratic engagement challenge, because climate action cannot be delivered by institutions. It has to be engaged in by people, acting in their myriad roles as citizens, as consumers, as teachers, as business people, so as planners. And this is where we need a whole of society mobilization to engage societies and to get a sense that actually climate change, in order for us to act on it, we have to see that other people are also taking it seriously. And this is where, coming back to this big election year, this super election year, this is where the political debate has to become much more real. It has to be, it has to contain solutions for people's everyday concerns, which, to be honest, are around very mundane things, very essential things, like the economy, jobs, health, education, livelihoods, security, especially peace and security, as Honorable Songa has mentioned at this time. So each of those aspects has a climate risk or opportunity connected to it, whether it's about housing or jobs. And so this is, I think, where we do need much more imaginative way to engage with people, which makes them more concerned about climate change, yes, but more feeling more confident that they have in it themselves the agency to address climate change in their communities, in the places that they live in, that they love, and make a contribution to themselves. So this is how I think through that dialogue, that engagement, that very ground-up mobilization, that we will address the trust deficits and recreate that social contract. Back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malini. We have two more speakers. Next, I'm going to invite Aditya Putri, a policy and engagement specialist from Indonesia. She's the founder of the Indonesia Sera Foundation, a non-profit organization working to advance the energy transition policy in Indonesia. So, so far, Indonesia has been one of the less ambitious major countries to tackle climate change. It also appears to be that Indonesians are comparatively less informed about the nature of climate change and its risks than other people in the Asian. With your climate activist background, could you please share your views on the nexus between climate empowerment and democratic responses to climate change?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me just begin by thanking for the honor of being part of this distinguished panel. Regarding Indonesia, I would like to provide the context and I would like to actually challenge that notion about ambition. Indonesia is a relatively young democracy. And in the context of climate, Indonesia is both a major culprit as well as a potentially major victim in the context of the climate crisis. So it is a major emitter due to its rapid loss of carbon stock, due to deforestation, extractive industries. It is very much a natural resource economy. Its heavy use of fossil fuel, notably oil and coal, resources that is found in abundance in the country, but at the same time being an archipelagic nation of nearly 17,000 islands with 270 million population, 1/5 or more below the poverty line. Indonesia stands to lose a lot from climate change. In fact, severe climate impacts have already started happening and affecting the local economy, resulting in the rise of the price of goods and services, etc. So it is already feeling the brunt of the early onset of the climate crisis. At the same time, as an emerging economy, Indonesia has a dream to escape the middle income trap by 2045. And this is not a unique dream. Many emerging economies around the world share this aspiration. And there have been efforts to combine these two goals for about a decade now. And I think in Indonesia, we've come to a point where within Indonesia, there is already an understanding of the policy narrative that in order to achieve the wealth, the welfare, the level of economic growth and development that Indonesia desires, that needs to do something about climate. It needs to start pursuing significant, meaningful, transformative climate action on the ground. However, when it is expressed as part of collective climate action globally, the targets that Indonesia has chosen for itself is not as ambitious as it could have been, and is not collectively, as part of the collective action, it's not putting the world on track for keeping the rise of global temperatures under 1.5 degrees. So in that context, Indonesia, yes, it's far less ambitious, but when viewed from a lens of, where it was a decade ago, Indonesia has indeed achieved meaningful strides in mainstreaming climate action into the policy narrative, and that is something that needs to be appreciated. So why is it still not able, right, to commit to a far more ambitious target? It has a little bit to do with how the country and its people view climate justice, and I think this I can address in the second question. But when it comes to climate action, given the tightening window that we're all finding ourselves in, the country has opted for efficiency. So big, systemic, transformative changes, and in the same time, weakening institutions, especially democratic institutions on the ground, given that any democratic practice and exercise at the moment is viewed as a very, very heavily expensive logistical exercise. Like imagine Indonesia this year has gone through an election cycle, and the whole cycle is costing Indonesia 1.5 billion USD. That's kind of the level of resources that would be required to really have implement and something like that, north of 1.5 or 2 billion rupiah would probably be needed if we were to pursue practice of co-creating climate action from the ground up at the same time, as Rafael has mentioned in his introduction, seize the opportunity for democratic renewal. So this is the context that the country is finding itself in at the moment. And my point of view as a climate activist is that the strengthening of democratic institutions from the ground up is actually very, very crucial, not only for the co-creation of an ambitious, a very comprehensive climate action plan for a country like Indonesia, which then hopefully would result in an NDC that is not just ambitious, but meaningful and transformative enough to really change the fabric of society, the economy, and puts Indonesia on a path for the kind of development, right, that it wants to pursue. But also it is crucial for the implementation of climate action, which, for example, will result in the energy sector, for example, will result in decarbonization projects, big and small, right, on the community level as well as on the systems level. If we're talking about big renewable energy, power generation systems being put in place, you will need the support of the community. You will need the community to make way for transmission lines. You will need the community to share their land with major renewable energy power generation plants. You will need the community to take part in new kinds of industries and economy. And this is where the empowerment and the strengthening of democratic practices that is rooted in consultation, meaningful and informed consultations, institutions that cater not just to climate awareness, but also that can really facilitate community level, individual level interactions, and also the provision of support system for individuals and communities to be part of this whole process is very, very crucial to the swift, rapid implementation of climate action at scale that we've all been talking about in all of the UNFCCC circles. And so it is something that are two parts of the same, piece of the puzzle. Democratic strengthening, democratic renewal, as the word has been mentioned here, as well as climate action. I have been in discussions before where it was floated the idea that maybe we don't need democracies. We need democracies to step back. It's messy, right? It requires a lot of logistics. It's very expensive. If we really want this to work, let's just, go for the emissions and usually technological, big technological solutions are being considered in these discussions, right? Geoengineering, for example, to really, really replace 20 gigawatts of coal power, just, put a nuclear power generation in place, right? That's going to replace it really quickly. And of course, those kinds of solution is completely missing the socioeconomic element of it, and also is completely disregarding democratic processes in the process of planning and implementation of such a solution. And unfortunately, these discussions have become more, have risen in frequency as the window for climate action is tightening by the day, by the month, by the year. So these are the risks these are something that really, really we need to look out for, that these discussions, and so these are discussions of false solutions, as we like to call it, and also at the same time discussions of tactics that are actually delayism, tactics that focus on that big one silver bullet that completely omits the implementation of democratic practice and actually, in many cases, requires the weakening of democratic institutions for those to go ahead. These are the things that we need to watch out for as the world comes together to, really, really picks up its pace in combating the climate crisis. I will stop here, and maybe, Madam Chair, if you would like to proceed to the second question.
Yes, so we've talked about climate justice a lot today as an enabler of climate ambition. Please tell us a bit more about your current work. What is your foundation doing to change the game in Indonesia when it comes to driving clean energy? And then finally, I'd also like you to speak to how do you think the democracy community can support the strengthening of democratic practice and of climate action in Indonesia as it prepares for the next NDC?
I'll try to be very short about this topic because, when touching climate justice and just transition, I think I can go on for 3 nights and 3 days on this subject. The key here is that, and I would also like to talk maybe more broadly, not necessarily about the work of the foundation. I've already addressed the fact that climate justice is very important, obviously on the philosophical and, foundational level, but even in the practical level, it serves the purpose of supporting rapid and swift climate action implementation on the ground. But however, at the moment, here in Indonesia specifically, but I think this is also shared everywhere else, there is a real struggle to define climate justice. In the eye of the government, climate justice is viewed as the North and South justice. Why should we, as emerging nations, developing nations, why should we be contributing to, the same kind of, why should we make the same sacrifices as those in the global North who have caused climate change before us? So we know this debate. It's been an ancient debate, but this has surfaced again and again. And no matter how much the effort goes into dismissing this view or into changing this view, it is very, very much persistent. And there's a need for the global community to think about how to address this persistent view about defining North-South climate justice, especially because in a lot of ways, for the global South, there are some real economic sacrifices, short-term sacrifices that will need to be made in order to contribute to emissions reduction that would serve the global purpose. And these are the things that always seems to hit a roadblock in order to, for example, ways to direct resources from the global North to the global South in a way that is equitable and that is just in the view of the governments in the global South, including Indonesian government. The second bit is also climate justice is understood differently between different communities within the country. So for the CSOs is one thing, for the business people it's another thing, for those living in urban areas is one thing. And it all has to do with the way short-term value is perceived against long-term value. It has everything to do with culture, with tradition. It has to do with aspirations to become an industrialized nation and also aspiration to remain an agricultural nation. So this is very uneven. It is as uneven as inequality that is actually at the moment is experienced in the country and in many countries around the world, exacerbated by the pandemic, as mentioned by Rachel earlier. Now, our current work is to still at that level where we are trying to consolidate the idea of climate justice, just transition. And in order to do that, there needs to be a lot of engagement needs to happen, right? There's a lot of resources, efforts being poured into establishing meaningful engagements, consultations, and dialogues on the local level up to the national level. And these are all additional efforts. So, and the reason for why there needs to be all of these additional efforts, because at the moment, the democratic institutions aren't able to serve this purpose. We have experienced a weakening of local level citizens' assemblies, right? From the rural level, from the village level, all the way to the city level, all the way to the national level, where actually these are forums that should be used to engage citizens, to raise awareness, and to provide a platform for dialogue and for achieving mutual understanding on the urgency, what needs to be done, what are the trade-offs that the community would need to make, what are the gains that the community can obtain from engaging into climate action, but they cannot. They have been weakened in such a way that they can no longer serve this purpose. So all of the efforts has been very piecemeal, like a patchwork of donor-sponsored programs, engagement programs, CSO or self-sponsored efforts, or even efforts sponsored by multilateral development institutions or DFIs, providing concessional finance for certain climate action implementation on the ground, and these have all. There's a lot of duplication all over the place. It would have been so much easier if the investments are being made first into strengthening the democratic institutions, including the parliament, because with climate action, when it comes to planning and implementation, of course, there's a technical element to that. So there not only would there need to be awareness building, but there would also be sharing of information, of imparting of technical skills to a certain level, and understanding, enhanced understanding of key climate actions, right? In order to basically put everyone on the same page. And these are, things that, it could have been done more efficiently if we had from the get-go, democratic institutions and practices that that are functioning, right, and that can be utilized to achieve this purpose. So this is something that the climate movement in Indonesia is collectively trying to pursue at the moment. But again, it is a slow and long and arduous process, and we are racing against the clock. So that's also another challenge in itself.
Thank you so much. I'll have to bring in our last speaker because we're running out of time. And our final speaker joins us here today in Seoul. He's Kanbar Hussein Bor. He's the head of the Democratic Governance and Media Freedom Department at the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Please come to the podium. And he's here with me in Seoul. Thank you so much for making time to join us today. And he's going to provide some context.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, so I'll try and be brief. Firstly, I want to say a big thank you to WFD, colleague Maureen, for organising this, and good to see colleagues on screen as well, and those in the room. 3 points from me, really. One is just to talk about, very briefly, the UK position on climate change. Secondly, the important interrelationship between climate change and democracy. And finally, some reflections on how democratic values can help in this regard. Very briefly on climate change, from the UK's perspective, we recognise that tackling climate change and ending poverty are two sides of the same coin. We cannot achieve one without the other, and we recognise that democratic values are intrinsic to this. We have a crucial role to play in this, and we recognise that our climate or development goals without full-scale economic transformation cannot be realised. The UK remains committed to delivering on net zero at home and driving progress internationally to keep within 1.5 degrees. The deal agreed at COP28 is a key moment in efforts to get to net zero by 2050. We welcome the establishment of the new fund at COP28, which covers loss and damage, and we announced up to 60 million for loss and damage. And we remain committed to spending 11.6 billion on international climate finance by April 2026. So just a quick summary of the UK's commitment to these issues. My second reflection is really welcoming the fact that we're having a discussion, because I'm struck by the fact that for too long the democracy space and the climate space don't necessarily interact, maybe take each other for granted. Take this session, or this summit really, we've only got one session on climate change. And from my perspective, it's welcome that we're having this conversation. I hope it will be the first of many. And in that regard, I think it's worthwhile recognizing that the tremendous impact, and we heard it briefly by some speakers, that climate change will have on our democratic societies, indeed society as a whole, including economy, including obviously the world we live in terms of climate, but also the structural issues around how we govern ourselves, immigration and economy. So those are profound impacts that the climate the sort of crisis will have on democracy. But it's also worthwhile noting that, and this is my third reflection here, that were democracy to be weakened, then our ability to actually address the climate challenge will also be significantly undermined. Because we know that when it comes to some of the most biggest challenges we face globally, most recently, for example, through COVID, that it was the adoption of democratic principles, namely around transparency, participation, accountability, inclusion, all of that led to much more effective responses by democracies when dealing with these issues. So in other words, with those democratic values absent, our response to COVID would have been much more worse. And correspondingly, one can argue that when it comes to the climate crisis, it's in the interest of the climate community to revitalize and reaffirm commitment to democracy, because without those democratic values, our battle against climate change will also be undermined. We've heard a lot about, for example, the NDCs, really, and I think those issues around inclusivity, transparency, public engagement, accountability, all of which are good, sound policy principles which will lead to more effective NDCs. My final reflection on all of this is that democracy, as we all know, doesn't expect it or expect processes to be perfect. It can be messy, it can be difficult. But one thing democracy has, which is of paramount importance, is that self-correcting mechanism, that ability to step back, be held accountable to the interests of the people and change, and have other voices come in. So in that regard, I think we must embrace it and ensure that this mutually reinforcing relationship can continue. So my final thought on this is that I know some of our speakers spoke about issues around law and order and what that means. I think it's worthwhile making this point quite clearly, that within a democracy, we all must be expected to work within the law, work within the legal infrastructure that we have. Were we to deviate from that, then that's a very stark path down towards a much more draconian path, and one which, dare I say it, heralds the spectre of autocracies who are not accountable to the rule of law and who see themselves above the rule of law. I wanted to sort of share that final reflection, because I know it's a challenge for civil society to engage in these issues, and our strong message is to do so within the democratic context in any event through the rule of law. So I'm conscious of time. I hope those reflections have been helpful. Thank you very much.
Yes, a huge thank you to all our speakers for their efforts and of joining us today, both virtually and in the audience. And of course to the audience for your interest, taking time off to come and participate in this panel, or rather in this session. For us, this is the start of a very urgent conversation on climate action and democratic renewal, which we're delighted to bring to the Summit for Democracy. We've run out of time for questions, but we encourage you to please send your questions to that link, and we shall be responding to all questions in a blog which will be available on our website next week. So do get in touch with us if you'd like to know more about our work and more so on our environmental democracy programs. I wish you a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be leaving the.
Thank you, Raphael.
room.
Thank you to our
Thank you,
speakers.
Raphael.
Have a good